Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again, Justin Vaught.
Hello. Good morning. Let's please welcome, thank you so much. I'd like to congratulate you all for getting in your seats this morning with a minimum of pushing and shoving. This is an important skill to have. I'm glad that we all demonstrated it. We are very lucky to be joined by one of the most interesting members of the U.S. Senate, Mr. Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin. Thank you so much for coming, Senator. It's
Happy
really
to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
I want to just kind of jump right into this. Right now, U.S. foreign policy seems to be more sort of up for grabs than it has been in recent memory. President Trump came in, and his ideas about U.S. foreign policy are sometimes sort of hard to pin down. Sometimes it seems like he wants to make a radical break from tradition. Other times, especially when you strip away the rhetoric, the positions seem fairly conventional, fairly traditional. It's hard to know. So it seems to me that this kind of creates an opportunity, maybe even a responsibility, especially for those in the Republican Party, like yourself, to help define a more sort of coherent approach. And you have suggested in some speeches you've made and talks you've given, a concept that recalls a Reagan-era line, peace through strength. But you've modified that a little bit by wanting to talk about peace through economic strength. So I'd like to start with that, and I'd like to ask you to sort of unpack that expression for us. What is peace through economic strength? What does that mean?
Well, first of all, there's no way you can have military strength if you're not strong economically. And if you take a look at just the way the world has been set up for us here, where America has, you combine America's size of its economy with the size of the European economy, it's over $30 trillion large. Russia, depending on how you measure it, somewhere around 2 trillion, probably less than 2 trillion. And look who's pushing who around right now. So just on the base of economic strength, you know, obviously the reason America's the world's superpower is we are sort of the last large economy standing, but now other economic powers are rising, whether it's China. Obviously, Russia is just rising its influence through its aggressiveness. So it starts with economic strength. And just based on the last panel, listening to General Allen talking about stability, but also looking upstream, when he's looking upstream in this whole evolution of radicalism, it starts with economic strength, the diverse economy, having the Gulf states, for example, utilize their oil wealth to diversify their economies. Now, just basic. In order to have an economy, I think you need three basic pillars. You need security, you need labor, and you need capital. Security is is more than just national security, homeland security. It's also security and certainty of the rules of the road. To have, yes, we need some regulations, but we don't want, a massive overregulation. You need a benchmark competitive taxation system so that you can compete globally. So there's an awful lot packed into security, but that is the first pillar. Then, of course, you need workers and you need capital. And a regulatory burden reduces your capital. An uncompetitive tax system also reduces your capital. So if you really try and simplify things from a macro standpoint, security, labor, and capital, that's what provides the economic basis for being strong to hopefully prevent anybody from ever challenging you militarily. That's, from my standpoint, that's how you achieve peace.
Okay, so, we have this expression in the States, right? Like, it's hard to argue against mom and apple pie, right? It's hard to argue against military strength and economic strength. The question is the details. So you mentioned a couple of things. Regulatory burdens was one of the first things you mentioned. Right. What are some of the regulations that you think are currently holding back economic strength?
Well, let's just talk in the United States.
Yes.
There have been multiple studies that peg the cost of complying with federal regulations around $2 trillion per year. Now, certainly in our political environment, people are getting immune to these massive numbers. I mean, how can you even contemplate what $2 trillion is? But that's a number larger than the Russian economy, for example. There are less than 10 economies as large as $2 trillion, and yet that is the burden America is placing on itself through overregulation. It's about $14,800 per year per household. I was talking to one Wisconsin paper manufacturer. He did a cost study on just 4 regulations recently issued under the Obama administration cost his business the equivalent of $12,000 per year per employee. So in America, we're concerned about wage stagnation. If you're concerned about wage stagnation, look no further than that $14,800 per year per household regulatory burden. And there's so many of them. I mean, it's across the board, all these government agencies. I think that's also a problem. I don't want to be critical of any other, I'll be critical of the United States regulatory burden. But let's face it, I think that's one of the reasons, perhaps, that Britain decided to exit the EU, is just the bureaucratic buildup within Brussels, and that's not good for any economic activity.
Okay. The second thing you mentioned was competitive tax. People in this room, a lot of the folks in this room are familiar with the VAT. This is something we don't have in the U.S., but it's part of Paul Ryan, who's from your state of Wisconsin. It's the border adjustment tax, which is a sort of variant on the VAT. You want the tax system in the U.S. to be more competitive. Do you favor the Ryan plan, the Trump plan, some other plan?
I've got some other plan.
Okay.
Actually, so in my business life, and by the way, I'm not really of this world. I'm really an accountant by education, a manufacturer by vocation. So I never involved in politics until I ran for the United States Senate in 2010. And so I organized my businesses as a C Corp, as an S Corp, and also as an LLC. There have been multiple studies that show that it's not the C Corp. The burden of taxation doesn't fall on the piece of paper that is the corporate charter. Employees and consumers pay the corporate tax in higher wages or lower wages and higher consumer prices. So my concept would be, rather than have employees and consumers pay the corporate tax, let's make the owners pay the tax. I'll stick it to Warren Buffett. This would be a true Warren Buffett tax, and in case anybody in America thinks that's radical, 81% of businesses have their income tax exactly like that. There's so many benefits to it. You eliminate the double taxation of dividends. You do end up taxing worldwide income, so you remove the barrier barriers to a free flow of capital across borders. Actually, we've had some initial scores. The distribution benefits of this type of tax plan is very equally distributed, with low-income individuals benefiting slightly more, because the way you collect the tax would be a 25% backup withholding paid by that C Corp to the federal government. So let's say you're a little old lady in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where I'm from, at a 10% tax rate. You'll get attributed $100 worth of income for your ownership in that company. $25 in tax has already been paid, but then your tax rate's 10%, you'll get a $15 refund, whereas old Warren Buffett's going to have to kick in probably another 10%. It's actually taxing corporate income on a progressive scale, very growth orienting, because it'd be based on cash flow. So you'd anticipate 100% expensing, which is probably the greatest pro-growth tax reform you can do. So again, this is a completely different concept.
Okay.
It's gaining some traction. I've been talking to a lot of economists, and hopefully that might be plan B if the other plans aren't passable.
Is border adjustment part of that?
No.
No, okay. You also talk about energy resources. You mentioned energy resources. Which energy resources do you have in mind?
First of all, America is blessed with a bounty of certainly fossil fuel resources. We should use those in an environmentally friendly way. Right now, oil prices are about half of what they were. Even though OPEC and Russia is trying to restrain production, why aren't oil prices going up with that restrained production? It's because America, through innovation, through horizontal drilling and fracking, has become the third world superpower when it comes to fossil fuel energy. We should use those resources. It's stabilizing in terms of economic growth. So, you need, from my standpoint, economic growth, regulatory reform. We need pro-growth tax reform, and we should use, in America, our energy resources.
Are you worried about carbon emissions?
Climate has always changed. I'm not a denier. I more or less adhere to the Bjorn Lomborg approach from the Copenhagen Consensus, where he's totally, agrees that it's man-made global warming. I'm probably a little more skeptical, but I have got an open mind on that. But from my standpoint, as Bjorn points out, when you have limited resources that you're trying to use to alleviate human suffering, there's far better ways to employ those resources, digging wells, combating malaria, combating AIDS. You're probably better off doing that and then allowing human beings to adapt. One little stat I throw out there is, if you can actually believe we could measure temperatures accurately 100 years ago, the world has warmed by about 1.7 degrees.
Right.
Over the last 100 years. Life expectancy has increased by more than 30 years. So I actually have a great deal of faith in human innovation. Now, another point to make as well is, climate has always changed. 20,000 years ago in my state was pretty well covered by a mile-thick glacier. So, I mean, there are other larger forces that are causing those glaciers to recede, and the sea level in the Bay of San Francisco about 20,000 years ago was 400 feet lower than it is today.
But just as a baseline, do you or do you not agree that human activity is the main driver today of climate change?
I would not agree that's the main driver. Obviously, man affects the environment. I'm a little more skeptical I'm primarily skeptical, can we really do anything about it? We got 7 billion people on this planet. We've got economies that are growing in India and China. We are a fossil fuel-based economy. We will be a fossil fuel-based economy really until those resources run out. I'm all for alternate uses of energy, but I'll let the marketplace pretty well dictate that.
What would you tell President Trump about the Paris Agreement on climate change?
There are a lot of people saying, well, there's really no mandates coming out of that in terms of U.S. spending. We're pretty well on our way to complying with whatever the dictates were of CO2 emissions, primarily because of the marketplace and the horizontal drilling and fracking. We have enormous natural gas resources, and just because the marketplace is dictating our utilities are switching from coal to natural gas. So maybe it might be best just to stay involved in that. But if there's anything in those Paris Accords that would cause America or force America to, spend hundreds of billions of dollars trying to hold back the tides, I'd be opposed to it. But it's kind of above my pay grade. He'll make his own decision.
Okay, but as far as we know, there aren't those kind of mandates. That's the kind of beauty of the agreement.
So maybe just, in some respects, kind of the uselessness of the agreement.
Why is that useless?
Well, it's toothless.
Okay.
So, I think that was one of the criticisms about it is we're trying to self-impose a number of limits that could really cost us economically, which reduces our economic strength, which I would reckon or would say would make us less secure. Mm-hmm. And there's really no requirements on these other economies that are growing and spewing out all kinds of CO2.
Okay. Let's talk about trade for a second and the role that trade plays in your vision, piece of economic strength. Why don't we make it specific let's talk about NAFTA. Has NAFTA, on balance, been good for Wisconsin?
I believe so, yes.
And
listen, in my business, we probably exported to more than 20 different countries. I think you have to have free trade. I think it does rise. It lifts all boats. It's got to be fair, though. And I think America, because we are the world's largest economy, I think we have been very magnanimous over the years. And I think people have taken advantage of us. And so the problem in promoting free trade is it's very easy to point to a plant that closes in a state and a similar plant opens up in Mexico or China or India or something like that. So it's very easy to use those anecdotal stories to really oppose free trade. Mm-hmm. It's far more difficult to make the case that in a generalized sense, everybody's better off. I would say, and this is really referring back to General Allen's comments, when you're looking upstream and you're looking at the real root cause of, for example, radicalization, it's lack of economic opportunity. Now, an awful lot of people would say, well, what America ought to do or the West ought to do is invest in those economies. Like we're hearing that right now in Central America. Let's take billions of dollars and invest in those economies. Well, they don't have the security. They don't have the public institutions to handle those investments. I would think a far more efficient way of investing in those economies is engaging in free trade, opening up your markets. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense, for example, for American workers or any developed country workers to be producing high labor content product. Let the developing countries that have all kinds of labor, let them produce those high labor content products, trade with us, and we can put our employees to our workers to far greater use in higher value added products. So I think free trade is really, in general, the best cure-all for growing economies around the world. I think it's the more moral thing to do.
It's an interesting way to look at it. What do you say, though, to the people in Wisconsin who say, but those high labor products, I want to make them, and I used to have a job making them, and now I don't? Or you have people in Europe who say the same thing. What's the response to them? How do you get them on the same page?
Well, I think that is why you have things like trade assistance, and you do try and help those displaced workers. Because let's face it, there are winners and losers in any kind of free trade, but the main winner is just the global economy and consumers. I think we have more than enough resources for retraining, short-term assistance programs to take care of those types of dislocations.
We talked about NAFTA. What about the other side of the globe? Was it the right decision to pull out of TPP?
I'm happy to have President Trump negotiate a better deal. I think one of the problems in these massive trade deals is you have so many different trading partners, so many different self-interests, that in the end, the deal may not work out particularly well. You might be better off breaking those into parts. But from my standpoint, we've got to engage in free but fair trade. Certainly America, I would say Europe as well. We can't be on the outside looking in some of these large markets as other people start engaging in different trade deals of their own. So I'm for free but fair trade.
How about TTIP?
Well, same thing. I mean, right now, I think that obviously we have a change in administration, got elections going on in Europe. It's an incredibly complex trade negotiation. I think you need unanimous approval within the EU. That's hard to get. And in order to get unanimous approval, it's going to be a far from perfect deal. So again, I've got an open mind. I mean, should we be doing these large trade deals, or are we better off breaking off into pieces? But I think Europe, I think America, because we have the strongest economies in the world, we should be leaders when it comes to trade. But then we should expect other economies, the people that have been taking advantage of more open trade, like China, like India, they have got to be high integrity actors on the world stage. And that's one of my problems with China is they do not protect intellectual property. We have seen with cyber attacks, the theft, let's face it, I mean, it was our NSA director said that it's, cyber attacks, cyber theft represents the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. That's a real problem. So we do need all of our trading partners to have high integrity and really abide by the rules and not engage in trade abuses.
The last panel, we spent a lot of time talking about defense spending. We were talking about NATO allies trying to get their defense spending up to that 2% target. You've talked about defense spending in the U.S. as part of this vision of a piece of economic strength. You think, broadly speaking, the United States should spend more on defense?
I think we have to. It's a very dangerous world. But to start this conversation, let me acknowledge, because we don't acknowledge it enough, our NATO partners have sent their sons and daughters, and they paid the ultimate price. I think it's somewhere around 1,000 sons and daughters of our NATO partners have paid that ultimate price. Far more than that have been injured. So that's, I mean, there is no price that you can put on that type of sacrifice. But no, I think we are living in a dangerous world. I mean, the threat of radicalized, violent extremists is, from my standpoint, growing. It's evolving. It's metastasizing, and our first line of defense is very effective intelligence gathering and sharing between countries. We have to have that trust, because that's our first line of defense.
So specifically, if we were going to spend more on defense, if the U.S. defense budget is going to go up, what would that money be spent on? What should it be spent on?
Well, first of all, I'd say missile defense. I'm not on armed services. I've never served in the military, so I'm not a military expert. But you've got to take a look and project in the future, where the threat's going to come from. And right now, you take a look at North Korea. That's a growing menace, growing threat. I don't think we've been spending enough on missile defense. It would be less of a threat if we had a more robust missile defense system. We have to look to space. I mean, that is obviously, we have enormously important assets in space that need to be protected, and we need to understand that that's going to be a kind of a vital area of future military conflict as well. So you've got to look ahead, and we've really got to get our act together when it comes to cybersecurity, and that's a more difficult issue.
So those are two areas where you think missile defense, cybersecurity, that would be where, if you were looking at appropriations or debating that's where you'd be wanting to see those resources go. Yeah,
but then you also need conventional forces, and you are going to have to fight conventional types of kinetic military activity.
President Trump's proposed budget includes a roughly 30% cut in the State Department's budget. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't think there's any agency in the federal government that spends efficiently, so I'm happy to look at any agency and take a pretty sharp pencil to it and certainly pare back. But I'm a fiscal conservative. I ran for two reasons. Obamacare I knew would not work, and those markets are collapsing. And in fact, we're mortgaging our kids' future. We're $20 trillion in debt today. The Congressional Budget Office projects in the future, over the next 30 years, the U.S. is projected to incur another $129 trillion worth of deficits. The problem in our own budgetary process, and this is probably getting in the weeds for European audiences, less than 30% of our budget is appropriated. 70% is all the mandatory spending programs, completely out of control. until we get serious about that 70% of the budget, the pressure on the remaining 30% is going to be just continue to grow. And that's what you're seeing in President Trump's budget proposal. But being a fiscal conservative, I'm also the first to say that foreign aid, if it's spent well, is money well spent. And so, we do have multiple branches of the government involved in this process. I think there's enough of us. Lindsey Graham, I think, is in charge of the Appropriations Subcommittee when it comes to the State Department. He will defend, and I'll help him defend. Certainly, soft power and things like foreign aid, where we can project our values through, well-spent foreign aid dollars, as opposed to having to spend probably more on military engagement.
Yeah, well, there's General Mattis, at the time, General Mattis, now Secretary Mattis, famously said, the quote is, he said, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition, ultimately. So I think it's a cost-benefit ratio. The more that we put into the State Department's diplomacy, hopefully, the less we have to put into a military budget. So you roughly agree with that?
And I think that's, one thing to kind of provide some comfort to a European audience. Take a look at who President Trump has surrounded himself. Take a look at his national security team. These are solid individuals that really have from my standpoint, a very grounded understanding of the world. The secretary that I'm dealing with mostly is Secretary Kelly, a four-star general, Gold Star parent, head of Southern Command. I can't think of somebody more qualified at this moment in time to be head of Department of Homeland Security. These are individuals that do not necessarily agree with what candidate Trump said on the trail, and yet he still put them in their positions, and he's listening to them and modifying his position. So, coming from the private sector, from the business world, entering politics, cold, like President Trump, I'm actually pretty sympathetic with the very sharp learning curve he's going to have to undergo. And let's face it, there are an awful lot of people that aren't making it real easy for him to kind of ease into that learning curve. So again, I want to cut him a little more slack. I'm looking at the advisors, and they're just first-class individuals with a great deal of knowledge that I think have probably a more mainstream view of what our foreign policy ought to look like.
Well, let's talk about NATO, actually, and on that theme. Did the president send the right message with his speech at the NATO summit this week?
I want to pull out a quote. At the beginning of his speech, he acknowledged that the only time NATO has ever invoked Article 5 was in defense after 9/11. Trust me, that has a great deal of resonance in America. At the very tail end of his speech, this is his quote. He said, "We will never forsake the friends who stood by our side." Now, from my standpoint, that's maybe a little more eloquent way of saying, yeah, we'll stand by Article 5. The whole speech, the whole event was about Article 5. So, from my standpoint, I think that was all blown out of proportion, that he didn't say the magic words. I think he did. And certainly members of the administration came out and said, no, it's obvious. So I don't know how many times, people refuse to take yes for an answer. But no, I mean, one of the reasons I came here to this conference was to provide that reassurance, on a unanimous basis. For example, and we talked about this in the green room. And this is extraordinary. You have to understand this. But this is from bipartisan Codels that have gone into Ukraine. But 2 Congresses ago, we passed a $300 million authorization for lethal defensive weaponry for Ukraine, unanimously. People don't realize how extraordinary that is, but I think it shows. And then the following Congress, we passed a resolution to reaffirm that authorization that was never used by the past administration. We've done a pretty good job, I think, helping train Ukrainian soldiers. They try and maintain their territorial integrity. But no, I think Congress is basically unanimously in support of our NATO alliance, support of our long-term commitment within the EU as well.
Does it say something, though, that you mentioned the $300 million to Ukraine? Does it say something that's extraordinary? That should be considered an achievement? I mean,
well, and take a look at I think some of our NATO allies were not in support of that. So one of the reasons probably the Obama administration did not utilize the authorization is, other people within the alliance in Europe were saying, oh, we can't win an arms buildup. I disagree with that position, but no, I think it was pretty extraordinary.
Let me ask you just very broadly a general question, and we're talking about Trump, we're talking about NATO. how would you describe, you've described your sort of vision quite well, I think, about how to do this. What is your baseline understanding of what his approach to foreign policy is and what his vision is? How would you describe it? How would you, when you're here and you're, you know, and people say, what's going on there? What are the words you use to describe it?
Well, first of all, take a look at what his background is. He was in real estate. He was a tough negotiator. He wrote the book Art of the Deal. It was interesting as I was going through the campaign, a tough campaign in Wisconsin, his fervent supporters never really took some of his statements as that was his position. For example, we're going to slap 35% tariffs on imported goods. They viewed that as an opening negotiating position. And I think that's kind of his approach to things.
They take him seriously, but not literally.
Well, no, they take seriously the fact that that's his opening negotiating position, which is different in the business world than maybe in diplomacy, where you kind of start with here's where we want to end up. In negotiation, you maybe sometimes start with a pretty outrageous demand to get to where you want to go. So again, I don't want to psychoanalyze him, but I'm just
Neither do I.
I'm just giving you my perception of it. Okay. But that's his basic approach. And as a candidate, when he gave a speech on foreign policy and he said America has to be more unpredictable, I mean, my first reaction is wrong answer. I mean, I think America has to be far more predictable. When we draw a red line, people need to understand we're going to maintain the red line, and if you cross over it, something's going to happen. Now, I'm assuming when he's saying be unpredictable, it's what's going to happen afterwards. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then I don't disagree with it from that standpoint. But we need to be very predictable. We need to be respected. Maybe a little more unpredictable in terms of what our response is. But I think it was very important that when we had proof again of chemical weapon use in Syria, President Trump did exactly what President Obama didn't do, which was act swiftly. Not come running for Congress and get an authorization he probably never would have gotten because so much time has run out and they've moved their military assets and it just wouldn't make the statement that needed to be made. President Trump acted very swiftly, and I think that will probably pay dividends long term as he continues to work with other potential adversaries.
But that's interesting. Do you think, had Assad used chemical weapons as he did more recently, while Obama was still president? This is after we had supposedly overseen these, the disarmament. Do you think that Obama would not have done almost precisely what Trump did?
No, what Obama would have done is what he always did, is he would make a speech and say there are going to be serious consequences. And people got that, and they realized, I can handle somebody saying verbally there's going to be serious consequences and then never following up on it. President Trump demonstrated there are serious consequences, and he acted decisively and swiftly, and that's, I think, what America needs to do.
Let's talk about this predictability question related to NATO. What is basically happening, and as Rose Gottemiller pointed out before, this is a message that the United States has been sending to NATO allies for a long time. Get the spending up, We've set this target in 2006, we've got to get closer. Bob Gates said it one way, Donald Trump says it a slightly different way. My question for you is, what should happen if that target, if our allies don't get, you're talking about sending a credible message of a credible threat. What's the stick behind the carrot?
Well, hopefully there won't have to be a stick. But let me just explain why that's so important. America, we have spent over the decades a tremendous amount of our taxpayer money. We back in the 60s, and actually let me get out my sheet again here, okay? Just throw some facts on the table. I'll start with the 70s. On average, America spent about 5% of our GDP on our military. The high was 7.6%. Carter dropped it down to 4.4%. And then the world became more dangerous. America was less secure. And so Ronald Reagan came in, boosted military spending in the 80s to about 5.5% with a high mark of 6%. The Soviet Union collapsed, which I think was a good thing, because then the West, reached our hand out and said, "Come on, Russia, come on in to integrate your economy. Let's build together." Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin hasn't accepted that outstretched hand the way he should have. In the 90s, now after that end of history, Clinton ramped our spending down to 2.8%, but on average we still spent 3.5%. Then 9/11 happened. Over the decade, we spent about 3.9% on average. Bush had to increase it to about 4.5%, and last year of Obama, we're back down to 3.2%. But again, all significantly higher than 2%. So the American taxpayer has been supporting not only America's military and to defend America, but we are the world superpower. We have been called upon to, in many respects, provide stability to the world. And kind of all we're asking is, can countries in Europe spend 2%? So it's just a reality. If that doesn't happen,
Right.
the most unpopular form of spending in America, in terms of the federal government, is foreign aid and military spending to defend people that aren't willing to spend money to defend themselves. So when we've got troops stationed in Europe, and we know that costs a lot of money, at some point in time, the American public will not be supporting the foreign aid. They will not support spending on military in places outside the U.S., and that would be a very dangerous point for the world. So people need to understand this is really about American public support, and of course, Donald Trump ran as a candidate saying exactly this. And so he's pretty well just following up on what his voters, and by the way, probably far more than just his voters as well. This isn't just people that supported President Trump. I mean, foreign aid, spending on military, defending other people that aren't willing to spend money to defend themselves is a highly unpopular thing to do.
Don't you think part of the problem, though, is that in the United States, voters tend to completely exaggerate the amount that we spend on foreign aid? So do you, when you meet with constituents, you explain that to them?
I try to.
And do you feel as though there's an understanding there that's increasing or not?
I hope so.
Okay.
But again, it's hard to overcome a basic public perception that half of our spending is, on foreign aid, and we're not spending it on ourselves.
Right,
so,
it's about 1%.
Again, it's why I started the conversation again, and I try and convey this as much as I can, 1,000 sons and daughters of our NATO partners who pay that ultimate price.
Okay, I want to start asking the audience to start thinking about questions you want to ask the senator. I'm going to ask him one or two more myself, but if you want to start thinking about what you'd like to ask him, we have an unusual opportunity to ask someone who really knows what's going on. I do want to, though, ask you one question before we turn to the audience. What do you make of the appointment of Bob Mueller as a special counsel to take over the investigation of potential links between the Trump campaign and Russia?
Well, first of all, a person of high integrity. Probably couldn't get somebody that was going to be accepted by both sides than Robert Mueller. The problem is, I think we need to get to the bottom of any kind of Russian influence, any kind of collusion. We need to get all the facts on the table. I was very supportive of Senate Intel Committee doing their work. Now, I'm chairman of the Homeland Security Government Affairs, the Senate Oversight Committee. I've yielded that investigation to the Senate Intel Committee because a lot of this information should remain classified. By the way, the only crime that we know has been committed is the leaking of classified information. So my preference would have been to have the Senate Intel Committee complete its job, its investigation, and issue a report so we could see if any further action needed to be taken. The problem with a special counsel and a criminal investigation, which is what I'm assuming that is, because I've run up against this in my oversight work, is the minute you have an investigation and people stop talking, you don't have access to documents, so I think it's going to be that much more difficult for Senate committees to conduct their oversight work. And let's face it, the history of special counsels or special prosecutors is that they just drag on and on and on. And in such a dangerous world with such enormous problems, I don't think we can afford to have this thing drag on. I'd like to bring this to a swift conclusion, take whatever action we need to take so we can move on and start addressing those things. So in the end, I said after our briefing with the Deputy Assistant or Deputy Attorney General is, be careful what you wish for. Democrats were calling for a special counsel, other people were. They got it, and now I think we're going to slow down the process, which is unfortunate.
You talked about the leaking of intelligence. Were you alarmed by the Times reports about President Trump's sharing of intelligence with the Russians during his meeting with them, a meeting during which he apparently, according to the Times, referred to the former director of the FBI as a nut job?
I'm concerned about all kinds of leaks. It's not good. And you've got intelligence professionals, apparently, that are leaking these things. They ought to know better. And it jeopardizes our national security. And it's wrong. It should be, hopefully, that we can find out who's leaking and prosecute them so other people won't do it.
The British were also upset about this, of course, too, about the Manchester.
Sure. I mean, listen, if America is providing intelligence to another country and it leaks out, and you risk sources and methods, you risk sources, you're risking people's lives, yeah, people need to be upset. I'm upset about the leakers.
All right, let's turn to our audience and see what you'd like to know. Let's start with this gentleman over here in the row here. Please tell us who you are, And please ask a question and keep it short. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Lazar Comanescu, former Foreign Minister of Romania. I'd like to raise a question to Senator Johnson. Yesterday in the first panel, when we were talking about global trends, one aspect was pointed out, the fact that as of now, 124 countries have as main commercial trade partner China, while the United States is at 56. How would you comment this trend, which seems to be increasing in terms of free trade, in terms of leadership in shaping rules and the way how the international trade is to be carried out?
Well, I think America has to be fully engaged in just about every market of the world. So again, that's why I'm for free, but we have to insist on fair trade. And I think we also need globally insist that China understands and abides by the rules of the world as well. You know, respects intellectual property, cracks down on the cyber attackers coming out of China, where you have that massive theft. But listen, I think China is being incredibly smart in terms of their investments all over the world. America should be making those investments, and we do, but China's doing them very strategically. I have no idea, truthfully. I mean, I do, but it's very unfortunate, China's military buildup. Who's really threatening them? I don't understand Russia's aggression. So, you know, there are many trends in the world that are just disappointing and, quite honestly, baffling if you certainly take a look at the U.S.'s viewpoint of these things. We're trying to bring peace and stability in the world. We've opened up our markets. We've been very magnanimous. I wish people would recognize that and work with us as cooperatively as possible, respecting the rule of law, respecting intellectual property rights, I think, and respecting trade deals, not engaging in non-tariff barriers and other trade abuses.
But I want to follow up on that just for a second, because you just spent a bunch of time defending increases in U.S. defense spending. For all the same reasons, wouldn't the Chinese say, well, of course we're going to increase ours too? How is it any different?
So what other power in world history has provided as sacrificed so much for others? And again, our NATO partners have done it as well. It's a pretty extraordinary thing in the span of human history. It's Colin Powell, I think others have said this too, is, we send our sons and daughters, to fight in battles, to preserve other people's freedom. We never do it for land. The only land we ask for is enough to bury our dead. And that's something pretty extraordinary that the U.S. and our NATO partners have done. You can't say that about some of these other powers. So again, you have to take a look at the world as it is. I think America, and obviously I'm biased, but in a very dispassionate way, America has been, I think, a phenomenal force for good and peace in the world. Some other people haven't been.
Okay. Yes, the gentleman in the middle here, in this row. Yes, thank you. Please tell us who you are, and please keep your question short.
Sure. Jalil Ghafouri from Afghanistan. Thank you. This is a good opportunity. Earlier, I wanted to thank the NATO partners and your great nations for the sacrifice did in Afghanistan, and we are so grateful. Though the mission in NATO is definitely complicated and failed, we need to, in fact, to check about a test, and definitely we are looking forward to get a result. But about you, sir, there are a lot of comments about your commitment in Wisconsin and also about your comments about the veterans. Me coming from Afghanistan, we've got economic motivated enemies and ideological motivated one. The economic motivated one are getting supported with the NATO partners, with the European, with your great nations, that at least we create them jobs, so that at least they would not join the terrorist group and feed them and their families. But the ideological motivated ones are supported by the external elements from different countries that I don't want to name. Earlier I named, in fact, they are well known by the world community. So you're talking about veterans, you're talking about supporting your troops and also your veterans. When there's this quick fix solution that you would stop, in fact, those sources, in fact, do not feed the ideological motivated one, then why don't you, did you make sure, in fact, to talk with the NATO partners or the Europeans or with the other Middle Eastern countries that they are directly involved feeding, in fact, those groups? Did you make sure to talk about that? That's a big fix and quick fix for the troops to not sacrifice more.
I would recommend that people read President Trump's speech in Saudi Arabia. I think you'd be hard-pressed to disagree with what he's saying. I think that's exactly what he's trying to accomplish, is get a global coalition of the willing, certainly of the Arab states, to cut off funding, to renounce and reject this radicalization of this extreme ideology. I think that's extremely important. My first trip as a senator was to Afghanistan, to Kuwait, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and I will never forget we visited the training mission there, and we had our own interpreters, and I was able to talk to people that are signing up and being trained for the Afghanistan military. And I would always ask people, because we were told, well, they're joining because they're being taught how to read, and so I was asking the people that I was talking to, why are you joining the military? Why are you joining this effort? And probably the last person I talked to had the most eloquent answer. It was very simply said, for my country, we want peace. If we concentrate, and I'm come from the business world. I didn't sit down and at the negotiating table and start arguing all the time. My negotiating technique was laying out all the areas of agreement. If we would concentrate as humanity on areas of agreement, let's face it, the vast majority of human beings on this planet just want to live a life. They want peace, they want security, they want safety. They want to be able to raise their children to hopefully have a better life than themselves. They want opportunity, they want prosperity. If we concentrate on that, and again, as citizens of the world, we work together to achieve that, that's probably the best place to start. Don't delve right into the differences. Concentrate on why we're, involved in these types of alliances.
I'm interested to follow up on his question. Is that are the Saudis, and I think we're referring very much to Saudi Arabia, and you brought up the speech. Are the Saudis playing a constructive role in countering violent extremism?
I hope so.
Well, right.
Again, I hope so.
And are they?
I believe they will be. Now, I think there's certainly elements today within Saudi Arabia that have been funding these things in the past. I mean, it's a very complicated web. But I'm hoping that this is kind of a start of a new beginning. It was not good under the Obama administration in terms of who we were supporting and who we weren't. And so now I think the Trump administration is bringing some real clarity in terms of who our friends are, who the real enemies to peace are. And let's talk about Iran. I mean, it is Iran that is widely recognized as the greatest state-sponsored terrorism in the world. And I think what was so destructive about the Iranian agreement, I know European partners engaged in that and agreed to it as well. I think it was a disastrous deal.
Why?
We have funneled at least $100 billion into the economy and military of our self-proclaimed enemy. We have not denied them the ability to become a nuclear power. Their behavior, it modified, not for the better, for the worse. So we need to recognize that reality. They are the greatest threat, and we need to resist that threat.
And
we have to resist it with strength and resolve.
The better alternative was?
Resist it with strength and resolve. The only reason they came to the negotiating table is because sanctions were having an effect. And what I always found offensive is when the Obama administration would talk about snapback sanctions. How do you snap back $100 billion that went into their economy and military? How do you snap back all the commercial deals that have been done? That was a fantasy. It was just inaccurate. It was false. And so we are where we are. They're on a path. We only possibly delayed their becoming nuclear power. They continue to test ballistic missiles. They continue to engage in all kinds of provocative behavior. It's not good, which is why we've got to strengthen our alliances and relationships with the Gulf states, the Sunni Arabs, and with Israel.
Next question. Yes, gentleman in the front row here, bow tie.
Yes, Konstantin Egert from Moscow. Actually, it's a cue from what you said, Senator, about Iran. During the election campaign, I understand, well, rhetoric could be slightly different from reality, but there was very strong rhetoric about, reversing the Iran deal and adopting a new policy. Doesn't look like the Iran policy review has happened in Washington. What do you think will be the steps of the Trump administration with regard to Iran, practical steps? And secondly, how does Russia fits into that? Because how does Russia fit into that? Because it's an ally of Iran and it might react if the U.S. tries to pressure Iran. Thank you very much. Actually, I also happen to think that the deal was a disaster.
Yeah. So first of all, campaign rhetoric is just that. It's campaign rhetoric. And then you get into office and you have to face reality. And the reality is the deal was done. The money's, is injected in their economy and military. The commercial deals are struck. So there is no really tearing up the deal. It's already completed. What you saw out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee markup last week was additional sanctions. We'll continue to do what we need to do to try and push back on Iran, but the cat's out of the bag. I mean, we're in a far more difficult position with Iran than we were prior to that deal. But I think you'll see greater strength and resolve. You'll see the strength of the relationship, try and have the Sunni Arab states be as a counterbalance. We need to solve the Syrian situation. If we can stabilize the events in Syria, try and push Iranian influence out of there, that would be a plus. So we just got to continue to push back on Iran. And quite honestly, try and support those elements within Iran that are trying to provide greater democracy, a more liberalization of the Iranian government. It's a real shame, the start of the Obama administration, there was not even vocal support when the students basically protested against a rigged election. And that sent a very bad signal and strengthened the mullah's hands in Iran, which is not helpful.
But of course, the hardliners in Iran oppose the nuclear deal, and it was the moderates who supported it. So, in a sense,
are there really moderates in the Iranian government? Do you think so? I don't think so.
Are there relative?
I will call them moderates, but they're not moderates.
So no difference. It makes no difference.
Oh, yeah, there may be hardliners, but the people in power are not moderates.
What about this question about Iran? Because it's an interesting point. How is there anything that Washington can do, and especially now that there's been a sort of idea that we should improve relations with Russia in some way, is there anything that Washington can do to try to drive a wedge between Moscow and Tehran?
Well, again, I think it's the strength of our alliance with the Sunni Arab states and Israel. Don't weaken Israel. One of the things I've asked European delegations, let's face it, European delegations that voted to poke a stick in Israel's eye with the resolution on settlements. If you had to move your family to the Middle East for a couple of years, what country would you move them to? I think it's pretty obvious. If you're a Syrian, would you rather be in Aleppo, or would you rather be in the Golan Heights, being under the governance of Israeli law? I mean, let's look at the reality situation. I think Israel is a stabilizing force in the Middle East. We should support them. We should help strengthen our friends. We should weaken our enemies. And the policy of the last administration and the Iranian agreement strengthened, again, the hand of our enemies and really weakened the position of our friends. I mean, we've got to reverse that course, and that's, of course, what the Trump administration is going to do.
Yes, sir. Question over here.
Thank you very much. We haven't spoken about Brexit yet, and obviously the UK-US, sorry, I'm Jonathan List from British Influence think tank. The UK-US special relationship is very important in Britain. President Trump was initially very, very enthusiastic about Brexit, but may have sort of tempered some of his language since then. And also there may be some confusion about whether trade with the EU is more important than trade with the UK going forward. So, I mean, do you see the EU as a more important partner for the US and the UK going forward, and what do you think the prospects are for a free trade agreement with both, first of all, with TTIP and with the UK, and what might the price be the US demands for a free trade agreement with the UK that the UK government is very, very keen to proceed with? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think they're both incredibly important partners, and I want to engage in free and open and fair trade with the UK as well as Europe. Just on a personal basis, when I don't like bureaucracy. I'm not a real fan of the U.S. federal government. We've gone way outside the enumerated powers of the Constitution, and it's not helpful. You take a look at some of the problems the federal government's trying to solve, they just make them worse. And my guess is, not being that engaged in European Union, but my sense is you've got that enormous bureaucracy that just continues to grow. And by the way, quick little insight for people from the business world. What I've certainly come to realize is the motivation of government, I don't care what government, whether it's Brussels or whether it's Washington, D.C., is the exact same motivations of private sector. It wants to grow. And often, in the private sector, in order to grow, you actually have to succeed. You have to produce a product or service that you can produce at a cost less than you can sell it for. You provide value to economies. Government, let's face it, failure allows you to grow. In America, we've engaged in a multi-decade war on poverty. We haven't even moved the needle. You can say a lot of our metrics are actually worse, having spent $13 to $22 trillion, which is about how much debt we're in. So when I saw the results of the Brexit vote, I'm just saying on a personal basis, I thought, yeah, blow for freedom. But then you start recognizing reality. This is very complex. So I don't know if it's good or bad. I'm hoping that all parties are very level-headed and that whatever the divorce proceedings or the divorce settlement is going to be on Brexit, I hope it's to everybody's benefit. But from my standpoint, the U.S. needs to engage with the U.K. as well as Europe as openly and as robust fashion as possible. We are the bulwark of freedom and stability and peace in the world. We just are. We have to recognize that. That's what's so important about NATO, about our alliances within Europe, and between that and the United States.
Next question. Yes, the gentleman in the back with wearing glasses, his eyeglasses, yes. The gentleman with the eyeglasses. Thank you.
We both
No.
have
Oh, I'm
eyeglasses.
sorry. I'm sorry. I meant the fellow next to you. I will give. Why don't you ask the question? I'll go
ask
to
a
him
quick
next.
question first.
I'm
So,
sorry.
Thank you. Chris Walker at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington. Senator, you indicated earlier that we should be concerned, and you asked the question of why it is Russia and China are deepening their investments in their military. Another aspect to this is massive investments in non-military kinetic forms of influence. So Russia has invested in its RT efforts, Sputnik. China devotes billions of dollars to its international media platforms. How would you assess the US and European response to this global media influence effort that's been undertaken by these authoritarian regimes?
Way too weak. It is interesting having come over on a number of bipartisan congressional delegations into Ukraine or Eastern Europe. Those that haven't been over to Eastern Europe very often, they're shocked by the reports of the propaganda, the misinformation, disinformation campaigns. That's why, Russia's meddling in our U.S. election didn't surprise me in the slightest. I mean, they've been doing it in Eastern Europe. They've been trying it in the U.S. probably for decades as well. They just have a new tool called the internet. So no, we've got to do a far more effective job of pushing back, countering their propaganda, disinformation. We've held a couple of hearings on this in my European subcommittee. One of the conclusions of the hearing is not that they're trying to convince the public, the world audience, that their system is better or what they're saying is true. They realize they really can't do that. What they're really trying to do is just sow the disinformation to get people to think you can't believe anybody. And they're doing a pretty effective job. I mean, they've just got to be, way more than chuckling as we're stepping all over ourselves based on, what meddling they did in the U.S. election and how it's tying up. Let's hope not tying up Washington in knots, but it's certainly had a very harmful effect. So we need to recognize who they are. We need to push back, but we need to use things like, whether it's Radio Free Europe, Voice of America. I'd love to see a much more robust and a coordinated effort by Europe, Eastern Europe, pushing back against RT because it's very effective. It's entertainment. It's propaganda, disguised as entertainment. Probably the most effective propaganda you can have. So we got to recognize how effective it is, and we have to push back and counter it.
Okay, and now to the gentleman who was waiting. Thank you. Please tell us who you are.
Thank you very much. President of China Institute of International Studies, a think tank under the Foreign Ministry. Probably it's a good place for us to say a few words. That is, sometimes when China, the name is mentioned by West media, and China is cast not in some good fashion. Just now we heard that China was associated with the theft on the internet, and also the people are concerned with the military buildup. So what I would like to say is that when you look at China's foreign policy emphasis, we are actually, just like Senator, you have just now said, we are pro-internationalization, globalization of the economy. And we are for interconnectivity, so we are for peace and development. That being said, my question is for you, Senator. And just now you mentioned that you are for free trade, and you are a member of the Republican Party. And in the US political apparatus, your views, how would you regard your views in terms of the administration and other members of the parliament, are your views regarded as a minority view or majority? Thank you very much.
Let me go to public opinion. I think it was because I am for free trade, but fair trade. Polling results, for example, we had an exit poll in our Wisconsin primary. There were more Republicans that thought free trade cost American workers jobs than created it, which I think is just an incorrect notion, but that's where public opinion is. And so from my standpoint, those that are engaged in free trade have got to do a far better job talking about the facts, the reality that it really is good for us. I mean, NAFTA has benefited Canada, America, and Mexico, and that's a good thing. You do want a rising tide lifting all boats, and it's just true. So hopefully, and certainly this has been my discussions with members of the administration that are engaged in this, whether it's Commerce Secretary Ross or the other members involved in the trade negotiations, is, yeah, go ahead and target and try and solve the or end the trade abuses by our trading partners, but boy, don't engage in protectionism. We need to keep all markets open to free and fair trade.
Okay, we have time for one more audience question, and we'll go to this gentleman with the red tie.
Thank you. Matthew Rhodes from the George C. Marshall Center and University of Wisconsin, 1997.
Go Badgers.
In the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly, Secretary Mattis names the lack of political unity in the United States as one of his biggest security concerns. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that issue and the challenges you see in dealing with that within Congress and with voters.
You know, I mean, the massive protests that occurred the Saturday after the inauguration, that was depressing. You know, I've been on both sides of in terms of presidential elections, the losing side and the winning side. I certainly want to do everything I could to help President Obama succeed at those shared goals of keeping America safe, prosperous, and secure. There does seem to have been a concerted effort on, from across the board, a real effort to sabotage this administration, which is not good. You can be opposed to policies, that's fine, but taking the streets the day after an election is not helpful. So I share Secretary Mattis's concern that way, providing some comfort. I'll go back to the unanimous result in terms of just one small example, the events in Ukraine. I think reality, I think providing proper information, I think if you would be involved in, for example, our business meetings or our committee meetings on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, you will see an awful lot of agreement. Certainly from my standpoint, I always like the concept that politics ends at the shore's edge. I don't think it's ever necessarily been true, but it's certainly an ideal that we should aspire to. And I think we're probably closer to that when it comes to foreign policy than sometimes you see on the domestic side of politics.
I'm surprised to hear you say that it was depressing to you when people came out on the streets. Those were peaceful protests. That's surely isn't that the hallmark of a healthy democracy?
Yes, but the day after an election,
is there a better time
to throw? Well, yeah. I mean, come out prior to the election, win the election, and then accept the results and give a new president a chance to govern without setting up immediately the resistance. I mean, yes, those are peaceful protests. There's an awful lot of vile things said, a lot of pretty vile placards and posters as well. So,
well, some of the responses were just some fairly vile things that were said by the person who won the election.
So anyway, from my standpoint, I'm looking for a little comedy in our politics. I'm trying to concentrate on the areas of agreement. We do. Let's face it. As a world community in the United States, we have enormous challenges. If we concentrate on those areas of agreement, that shared purpose of, peace, security, prosperity, we're in a whole lot better spot than, again, starting that negotiation, protesting and concentrating on the areas of disagreement. So again, fine, yeah, there are political disagreements, but let's concentrate on the areas of agreement. Let's tackle these enormous challenges.
Fair enough. I think that's a good note to end on. I agree. Ladies and gentlemen, lunch is available just outside in the foyer. Please let me remind you to be back in your seats 1:30 for the next session on the financing of terrorism. At the same time, in the Danube space, just outside in the lobby downstairs, the discussion of the GlobSec Future Forum will be on the future of free trade, which we've been discussing here, battle between globalism and protectionism. We had a great conversation. Thank you so much, Senator, for coming and make yourself available and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Thanks.